Hi, everyone, and welcome to Breaking the Spell. So I have two very special guests with me tonight because I just read this fantastic book on degrowth, and I'm very excited to bring two co-authors here to discuss the book with me. And I have the book here. It's called The Future is Degrowth, A Guide to a World Beyond Capitalism. So who I have with me tonight is Andrea Veta and Aaron Vansintjan. And there are two of the co-authors here. There's a third one here called Matthias Skribnitzer. And I am just very grateful to have two guests on. So it means I can talk less and I can really explore the ideas of degrowth even more. So let me just give a quick introduction first. So Andrea Veta is a transformation researcher, cultural anthropologist, activist, journalist, using degrowth, commons, and critical ecofeminism as tools. Aaron Vansintjan is a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Vermont, and he's investigating the effect of gentrification on food access of marginalized communities and how people may use food to resist or challenge developmental narratives. His research interests are in comparative urbanism, political ecology, ecological economics, degrowth policy, and science fiction, which I may want to talk about. So first off, let me say thanks to both of you. Thanks for coming onto the show.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm really looking forward to your questions.
Right, great. So I just want to give a very quick introduction because, as you know, this podcast is based in Singapore, but I just want to share a little bit on what's happening, even for me personally, and also on the channel. So on this channel, we did a review of Less is More by Jason Hickel. That was obviously a very popular degrowth book, and we did that video as one of our first videos on the channel, and it garnered a really huge response. There also has been a very small degrowth community that has developed in Singapore. And what I did not too long ago, which was last year, November, was I gave a talk at the National Library of Singapore on degrowth using Less is More. And at that event, I actually plugged your book. And I told the audience there, please look out for the book. And, I really suggested that if you want to follow up, onto their interests, they should really read this book, of course. Also more recently, actually, this was also last year, there was this local play that was produced by a local playwright. His name is Alvin Syed. And he actually specifically said that the content of his theater play was inspired by degrowth. And in the play itself, what happened was there was a very important segment where we have a local environmental scientist. His name is Winston Chow. He's actually someone who's also involved in the IPCC climate report. So he's not very notable prominent figure, and he also in that theater, his voice or his interview was used in it, and he ruminated about degrowth, and he actually felt that we may have to consider it because he felt like people were not taking the climate crisis seriously enough. And this is actually a big change because I know that publicly speaking, this person, Winston Chow, actually disavowed from degrowth on his Twitter like some years back. So to see this change in tone is very surprising. Yeah. So in any case, right, like I said, I actually have seen a couple of videos where the two of you are speakers and have been interviewed as well. But I really want to try something a little different for us when we talk about, your book. So unlike Less is More, where you kind of get an idea about Jason Hickel's personal background, we don't really get any information on the three of you in your book. And so I really like to usually start this podcast with personal stories because I find that they're usually more easier to resonate with or they connect better. And quoting from your book, actually, you write, degrowth concepts can only reach a wider audience if they become meaningful by directly relating to everyone's lives and if their experience has the promise of radical abundance rather than has a threat of individual renunciation. So anyway, I think there's enough intellectual arguments out there for degrowth. So, I really want to cover something a little bit more that's been a little bit more neglected, which is, the personal narratives, the personal interest, right? Why do we want to see a pathway, to a world beyond capitalism? And, what is it, at stake for all of us? So, yeah. So what I'm going to do first is, ask you guys an opening question, and obviously there may be some people watching who don't understand degrowth, want to know what it is. So we need to spend a bit of time introducing that. Then after which I want to get into themes in the book, like the different critiques of growth, and talk about how degrowth can be actualized, address misconceptions, criticisms, and why degrowth to me is not some pipe dream, but it's a serious guide to a world beyond capitalism. So let me first start. Let's start with Andrea, ladies first. So when was the first time you realized something was not right with the world? And, you know, connected to degrowth, if you like, you know, and, you know, share with us, you know, how did you come across it?
That's a very interesting question. And actually, I think I would like to turn it around. So because actually, I like the world a lot, and I think everything is all right with the world. It's just maybe it's not everything all right with how humans, and especially some humans, treat other living beings. So I think I came more from the angle of recognizing how beautiful our world is and how wonderful. Like, I remember when I was a child, maybe age 10 or something, picking flowers for my mom. It was in the morning. And there was this meadow. It was still a bit wet from the night. And there was all these very beautiful flowers. I live in Germany, and in May here, it's a really wonderful season where it's a lot of flowers just erupting and blooming, and the spring is coming. And I was feeling like this very deep connection to this beautiful place and this beautiful world, and suddenly realizing like what a gift it is. I can live here with this body in this environment, with these plants and these other living beings like the bees and the butterflies around me. And yeah, I think ever since, it's more the love for other beings that's like pushing me forward to think about how could we realize a society and structures around ourselves on different levels, like on a very small level of families and communities, and also on a bigger level, like intra-regional organization and government, to respect each other in a way we all deserve. Be like from the smallest being, or the plants and the trees, to, of course, the other human beings. I also love humans because I think they're really a fantastic species. Like they are so funny sometimes and so caring, and it really makes me so sad to see that such a lot of human people also, they don't have the space and the environment to really be what they are meant to be, you know, like they live in shitty places, they have the wrong passports, they are held back by a lot of borders, they don't get the love they deserve as a child. And this all, I mean, it's not like, this is not right. And it's very simple, I think, why I am then at the end kind of devoting my life to trying on different levels to change this. Yeah, with like on a political level, but also on a personal level. So, for example, I most part of my daily life, I live in a community in the countryside between the city of Berlin and the Polish border. And we are trying to inspire a different kind of local development from below, and think with different people, newly immigrated people who live there for a long time, what could be a good way to live together at this very place. And then I'm also working journalistically in a popular magazine where we report a lot about places and people who try to live in a decent way and explore ways to a good life for all. And then also sometimes I write academic articles or books. But I realize for me personally, it's very important to mix these activities, to teach and to be with like very diverse people in my daily life, and also to be a mother. And elderly companion to other children, that's really so enriching. And I think, yeah, that would be my plea for degrowth.
Right. It's a very personal one, and I like it. Yeah. Aaron, why don't we hear from you? You're muted, Aaron.
Sorry, classic mistake. Yeah, it's hard because it's hard to find a narrative, like when did I first come to degrowth, but I could also just say a bit of my background is that from basically when I was born, my family moved around a lot. Both of my parents are from, like my mother is from a agricultural background, and that, like she grew up on a farm, and my dad is agricultural engineer. And the first thing, basically 4 months after I was born, we moved to Nicaragua, where my father worked supporting smallholder farmers there. And, you know, I guess, and then we moved to different places, Guatemala and then South Africa, growing up. So, and it was always in this context of, you know, it was basically, I grew up politically, in a political context, and in a context of parents who felt very strongly about, you know, shaping their lives so that they can help make the world a better place. And at the same time, I think, you know, I feel like I grew up in the 1990s, and in that context, you know, those were the Clinton years and this kind of like era where it seemed like things were only going to get better and better. But of course, that's not true. And then I graduated high school during the financial crisis, and you know, the 2008 financial crisis, and very quickly saw that a lot of these ideas of international development that I grew up with were very, very flawed, and really were created as a way to justify a certain kind of development, which I also saw growing up, you know, living for 6 years in South Africa right after apartheid ended, was also like a very political experience for me. So yeah, like I think, I guess in some way I came to degrowth from this background of thinking critically about like this international development mantra, and that I grew up with, and that was around me very much as I grew up.
Yeah, I think what I like from both your answers is there was something, it seems very intrinsic for both of you to want to change the world. So I do want to prop a little bit on that, because I'm very curious whether do you get, in some sense, you know, people resisting that, people saying to you, you know, don't be utopian and don't be idealistic. You know, this is the world we grew up in. And so obviously they'd be very resistant to the idea of degrowth. So that's one question. And the other thing I just want to ask, which actually is supposed to be the natural follow-up to what the both of you have said, is how did the two of you, or three of you actually all together, decide to get, how did the three of you get together to write this book? Yeah. But, you know, answer as you like. Andrea, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. There's all kinds of people saying to me all the time, you're utopian, you're naive, especially my mother, but also other people.
And how do you respond to that? I mean, obviously there's so much carrying, there's so much weight you're carrying, because you have an intellectual argument here, you have, you know, your ideas, your beliefs, the evidence. Yeah, how do you respond to that?
Yeah, I think most times I respond to that I say, like, the most unlikely and in this sense utopian idea is that everything stays like it is, because it won't. Because change is already there, you know, like the idea that it will be like in the 70s or 80s, or I don't know what time people have in mind when they say, oh, everything should stay like it is, orderly the same. It's just crap. I mean, already now, even if we stop like carbon emissions right now, we would head for a world that is 1.7 degrees warmer than it was 100 years ago. And we already see like this is affecting all our lives so much. Like now it's winter in Middle Europe and it's supposed to be snowy and ice cold, but it's raining all the time and it's 8 degrees. That is not normal at all. And like the lake I live nearby, it has like 0.5 meter less water than it had 5 years ago because we have a kind of ongoing drought in summers. And it is all, I think you can tell from the places you live in, like we're here paneled from very different places in the world, from Singapore and Canada and like Middle Europe. But everywhere, I guess, we can feel what's happening. And so there is no chance in structures staying the same because the very nature is altering so much. We have to respond to that. And we can decide like to respond in a proactive way, or we can respond to it in a reactive way. And I like try to have this possibility to answer in a proactive way, even if I'm a bit skeptical about how fast we can change things. But what we can do all the time is decide like how we want to lead our lives, at least if we have certain privileges like I do, like I was born in a country giving me a passport, allowing me for a lot of things in a country that has a kind of more or less functioning welfare state. And I'm a white person. I don't come from an academic background, but still I have the backing from my parents who helped me a lot. And so I think it's our duty also like to take these privileges and at least try to change the structures around us.
Love it. Aaron, you want to respond and also maybe just share like what I was asking, whether how did the three of you come together to write the book?
Yeah, I think Andrea's answer is very much along the line of what I think, and yeah, like how I experienced that myself, and just to repeat that this idea of that you know we have this very short time period of 150 years, and the idea behind sustainable development or whatever is that we can sustain that into the future. But if you look at human history, we've been constantly changing, and so the idea that we can keep things the same, even if we don't think about the environmental crises, put that aside, that idea itself is very ahistorical. But then, I think a very important thing we can do as humans is we can get together and we can decide that we can change things, and then we change things, and we've always been doing that. So I think it's actually a very reasonable thing to say, well, we could just decide to do things otherwise. We could just decide to have a very different financial system, a very different economic system. And I think that's threatening to a lot of people. Yeah, just to underline what Andrea said, but for how we decided to work on this book, actually, I think Andrea would be better placed to answer that, because I only joined later in the project.
Yeah, Andrea, please.
Yeah, actually, Matthias and I, we were working on the topic of degrowth for a long time together. We were doing like political activism and organizing conferences in the beginning for the movement Attack, which in Europe was organizing for a better regulated financial system. And it was after this financial crisis you already mentioned, Aaron, in 2008-9. And yeah, we were working together there, and also we were studying together, two of us. And then, yeah, we organized one of the first big events around degrowth or growth critique in Germany in 2011. Matthias and I and a lot of other people, like in a big organizing committee. And then we also organized the first International Degrowth Conference in 2014 in Leipzig. And so somehow we were asked by our German publisher, who is a publisher who publishes introductions into several political topics, if we would not like to write a book on the topic of degrowth or post-growth in German, where no introduction, like short and concise introduction, was available then. This was, I think, in 2015 or something. And so, yeah, we wrote it. And it, yeah, was quite a success in Germany, like in a modest way, in certain academic bubble, but still. And so Matthias asked me, oh, would it be nice to translate it into English? And I said, no, I don't want to do it. I don't have time for that. No way. But he was still pursuing this pathway, and I'm very thankful to him. And yeah, then we got the chance to publish it with Verso, and we were like, yeah, but we urgently need somebody else who will write that with us together, like in a new version, because basing on the German book, but for an international audience, like we have to alter things. And also there was published other books in the meantime. And so we came to Aaron Vansintjan. I think you know Matthias a bit, but I did only know you from pieces you wrote, from Uneven Earth especially. And was very fond of you because of your thinking about like technologies and stuff. I was doing a PhD on convivial technologies and was a lot concerned with technologies and degrowth. And so we were very happy when Aaron said, oh yeah, I can imagine doing that with you, because we didn't know if you would have time or something. And then, yeah, basically Aaron wrote our book anew in a better way.
Well, I'm really glad that, yeah, I'm really glad it came out in the English version.
Yeah, and we had like regularly video calls actually, because we are not on the same, based on the same continent, and that was really inspiring and interesting, and thinking the beginning of a lot of common work that might still come in the future.
Cool. So actually, you know, even though we've talked quite a bit, if anyone's still watching, you know, they may still need to understand what degrowth is. So perhaps Aaron, could you like just provide some kind of concise definition? And one of the ways that I personally feel that is useful to define degrowth is really if you juxtapose it against what's happening right now, which is, you know, called eco-modernism. So that's kind of like the paradigm that we're operating under, which, you know, a lot of mainstream environmentalists are advocating. And just to give a bit of background if anyone's not understanding this, basically the assumption right now is that we can use technology to resolve, you know, the climate crisis or other ecological problems. And, you know, if we do not stay on this course and deviate from an economic growth-based paradigm, then the fear is that we would have economic stagnation, things will grind to a halt, and, you know, everyone would just starve and die, something like that. So yeah, so Aaron, why not you just take us on as to what degrowth is and how it, you know, it differs from what I just described.
Yeah, so this is like a shortened version of the definition that we use in the book, but I would say that degrowth very roughly is the idea that we can have an economy that doesn't necessarily depend on economic growth, where the amount of material and energy we use contracts or lessens or is reduced, and at the same time meets well-being for all. So that's kind of a very broad definition. And to your point, Well, one thing I would say is, eco-modernism, I think, is maybe not a good term, because in my opinion, there's nothing ecological about it. You could call it maybe like green modernism, because it's kind of painted on. And I think part of what we say in the book is that degrowth is a holistic approach. Like, you have to integrate lots of different critiques of the present system, and that's something that's really valuable about degrowth. While I think eco-modernism kind of basically takes the ideology of the current system and extends it outward into the future. So just to say, like, I think how it strongly differs is that eco-modernism or green modernism proposes, really doesn't criticize what we call social metabolism, which is the amount of stuff an economy or society uses. And degrowth makes that itself political. So the idea that actually a huge part of the environmental impacts or that we're seeing, and the social crises that we're seeing, is just this acceleration of the amount of stuff society uses. And eco-modernism doesn't try to reduce that, it just tries to make it more efficient and decarbonize it. But even if we decarbonize if we decarbonize the economic system, we still have massive biological crises separate from that might actually increase, because the impacts will be shifted to another thing. So biological diversity collapse, soil erosion, eutrophication of water systems, toxicity in our water systems. The list goes on. So, and this is just accelerating in all spheres of the world. So I think degrowth really tries to take a holistic approach to these issues and assess the science as it is, and begins from there.
Right. So, yeah, I like the idea that you talked about, which is, we need to examine the social metabolism of our economy, and how degrowth is not simply just about addressing, carbon emissions. There's a lot more that goes into it as well. And as you say, it's very holistic. So I want to just say that also when it comes to degrowth literature, usually, the targets of degrowth is the global north, right? And there's very obvious reasons for that, because the egregious profiteering, the disregard for biodiversity, the imperial mode of living, another very cool concept that I've learned. So when I was thinking about what you said about social metabolism, I thought one of the most easy, relatable ideas I would communicate to someone is the Earth overshoot concept. So you ask what if everyone lived like the American, or what if everyone lived like a German? And I've got the numbers here. So, if someone consumed like an American, you would need 5 Earths. Australia is 4.5, Germany is 2, Japan 2.9. So my question actually, is about this, right? As Andrea mentioned, we're from 3 different countries altogether. So is the degrowth analysis and critique as applicable to smaller nations? So whether it's Scandinavian countries, Japan, Singapore in this case. By the way, Singapore's Earth overshoot number is 3.7. So if people try to consume like a Singaporean, we would need 3.7 Earths. So in any case, right, what I want to ask, is it just as applicable? Are there certain constraints and nuances we need to have? Because, obviously different countries have different constraints. And yeah, what kind of moral demands or policy design, would we need to be more, discerning about? Andrea.
I think definitely yes. It's not only a perspective like for very big countries, and as the concept of imperial mode of living is highlighting, which is why one of the reasons I like it a lot is that they are saying that this imperial mode of living is not something that is only happening in the global north, but it's about a global middle class they are talking about. So that in a lot of countries, that are overall maybe not as rich as the US or Canada or Germany, but there is still a middle class of people being part of these global imperial modes. And I think this resonates a lot with like geographical models of world systems that have very much to do with different centers and different peripheries. And there are different sub-centers, and it's not all even like in big global north cities. Also in cities like countries like the US or in Germany, there's a lot of poor people, and people really have a problem to come by. Now they lose housing, and with the rising inflation, they don't have enough to eat even. I mean, but still, of course, the degrowth concept is one that is developed in close relation to movements in a lot of countries all around the world, but it's developed in Europe. And so I think also a lot of policy proposals might be suitable for European countries, having a very distinct history of, for example, how the relationship between state and market is a very distinct history of welfare state systems, etc. And I think one of the points of the degrowth concept is that there will not be a universal model for all countries in the world, but it's a lot about making place for a kind of pluriverse. I really very much like this concept of pluriverse, and to think about like how could solutions, societies, contexts look like at a specific place with a specific environment, with a specific history, which is very different, I guess. So
I think it's interesting because, yeah, as Andrea said, like as we talk about in the book, also like degrowth kind of originally came out of you know, or came out in response to this post-development kind of movement, which criticized a lot of the, you know, international development ideas around you know, at the time it was around these unilateral organizations that were imposing certain kinds of development. So high extraction, high cutting public budgets, and kind of accelerating economic growth. And then the label sustainable development was kind of slapped onto that, but it basically stayed the same. And so degrowth, actually, the first time it was really used by French activists was sustainable degrowth as a kind of like against the sustainable growth narrative. And that was directly inspired by a lot of critics of this kind of development narrative, and especially in Latin America. But you know, you also had, for example, in the Philippines, you had people like Walden Bello who were very strong in the anti-globalization movement, and so degrowth kind of I would say mirrors that, but historically has proposed like policies for Western kind of context. So when you talk about what kind of policies would work outside, because and we can get to this later, but it's not just the metabolism aspect that degrowth talks about, it's also the ideology of growth that it talks about. And I think there you have also some interesting things that really applied to a lot of global South countries as well. But putting that aside for a second, when you then look at, okay, so what would be a good model of development that doesn't exceed those planetary boundaries that you mentioned, that kind of like footprint of different countries. So I don't know if you've discussed Kate Raworth's work on your channel yet, but she has this concept called donut economics, where you have an outer boundary of the planetary boundaries, of the environmental boundaries, and then an inner boundary of well-being. So a society should kind of live in the middle there. And then when they did analyses of different countries, which countries are exceeding and or which countries are able to kind of be in that donut, surprisingly, it was countries like Costa Rica, Cuba, and Vietnam that stood out as very clearly doing quite well with those indicators. So then you have to ask, okay, what are these countries doing well? And they have very good welfare systems. And also a lot of, well, especially Cuba and Vietnam, they have a history of communism, and they were excluded from that global market and had to develop their own kind of means to achieve a basic standard of living for everybody. I think it kind of, there's a slogan in the degrowth community where people say, we talk about degrowth so the global south can find their own path to development. So there's no like one way, but there are many different ways to get there. And I'm really excited. I was really excited about this particular conversation because for me, it's a very interesting question how Southeast Asian or Pacific countries in the Pacific region might actually take this question of degrowth and run with it in totally their own way. I think there's also a lot of questions around, a lot of the policies that we talk about in the book are really dependent on this kind of like liberal state model, where that might not apply to different countries around the world. I don't think, like, I have more experience with Vietnam where I studied for a while. Like, I don't think a lot of the policies that we advocate for would actually be applicable in Vietnam, just because the state model is totally different. And yeah, so I think those are interesting questions to ask and to explore.
Yeah, actually, it's nice, Andrea, that you brought up Warren Bellow and the anti-globalization movement, because in some sense, degrowth, as you said, is some sort of an offshoot of that. And one of the things about degrowth is and keen interest in developing localized economies, right? So if I give like a really simple example, it's much better to say grow your own beef than to import the beef from another country, because obviously there's a negative externality there of trying to import products and services from other nations. So my question really is like in a degrowth paradigm, are we looking at a less globalized world in the sense that I've defined it? Obviously, it doesn't mean there's no international solidarity or anything like that. But are we talking about a world where there's going to be less shipping and trading, in order to move towards a more decarbonized world? So
yes, I think it's a very important question. There is a concept in degrowth discussion that's called open localism, and I like it a lot. So the idea is that really to have a lot of economic activities at a local or regional level as much as possible, actually. But then to be really open about other people, other concepts, and like trans-local, trans-regional, international connections. And I think this is very important to stress, but because in the multiple crises in the world we see now, there's a lot of right-wing and fascist ideas about bioregionalism and regions just caring for their own people and building like very high borders around what they do. And that's not what degrowth is about. But degrowth is about how can we really organize our economic activities on another level and reduce, of course, this kind of transport and this often very absurd long supply chains that run around the whole globe just to give a bit more profit to some corporation, which is not sensitive in any way. And then the question is very interesting, like how to build up new kinds of connections between different regions and different people, also in an economic sense. Because even if I live in Middle Europe, I'm very fond of drinking coffee, for example, and I would very much like to do so also in the future. So how could we shape this kind of relations with people living in countries where you can grow coffee in another way than they are shaped now?
Yeah, I just want to say that's why I asked that question, because I feel that when I talk about degrowth to people, sometimes they are worried that this is what we're going to lose, right? There are a lot of countries right now where the economy is very dependent on international, goods and services coming in, and they pride themselves on that. And so, what would happen to these cities, and what would it look like in a degrowth future? So yeah, that's why I asked it. Aaron, you want to take a step?
Yeah, I think that's a very complicated question, and it's like we're dealing with something that doesn't exist, and thinking about it in terms of the world that exists now. But what, like adding to what Andrea said, I think I think a huge question that degrowth emphasizes is self-determination, like the ability of people to be able to determine that what happens with their own territory. And I think when you start looking at globalization and what the anti-globalization, or sometimes they called it the alter globalization movement, was calling for, was that people should have the right to be able to stay on their territory and not be evicted because it's more profitable for a company to grow palm plantations versus there being a rainforest that's being used by indigenous people. Or where peasants are actively farming this land in a very different way and sustaining themselves with it. So I think that's kind of like a really important question, is the question of power and who has the power. And that's kind of where I think that has to be emphasized in this discussion about localism, because often we speak in these really technical ways about it, of like what kinds of food who will have, what kinds of food different people will have. And yeah, so that's one thing. And I think if you start from that perspective, you can actually start thinking about a different system that is democratic and just, and that's based on people's specific experiences and political systems, and from there you can start thinking about like what a sustainable global economic trade would look like. Yeah.
Right. I have to say that yes, I do think that, and this actually leads to a question that I do have to ask the both of you, because on that question of self-determination, I think that's what the pandemic has taught all of us, right? Many countries have seen that, in a global, during the global pandemic, right, where there was very little activity across nations, trading and all that, we all had to be dependent on ourselves. And there's actually some hopeful signs, right? Like during the from the pandemic, where there have been, say, places which are opting for more work-life balance or flexible work arrangements. There's somewhat more social recognition for essential workers. And we also see signs of some form of biodiversity or ecological recovery, just because we weren't creating so much activities, economic activities. So do you have any takeaway lessons that you think that the pandemic has taught us and that can relate to degrowth really well? Andrea? Oh.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
Well, a lot of lessons, like a very interesting lesson, at least here in Germany, I don't know about the other countries, was that there was suddenly a lot of talk about the systemic relevant jobs. And it turned out that the systemically relevant jobs, these were jobs mostly poor paid and women's jobs, like somebody selling the foods in the supermarket, nursing work in the elderly homes or in the hospitals, also some kinds of transports, workings, and of course all the workers who do the trash and recycling business and stuff like that. And I think that was a very interesting moment that people realize, what is the kind of activities needed for sustaining our life on a daily basis. And it gave way to a kind of discussion that somehow, unfortunately, wasn't taken deeper about the relevance of care work, which I think is one of the core discussions that's all also in the degrowth discussion, like what kind of economy we are aiming at. We are aiming at an economy where care is in the center, because that is what is sustaining our lives. And we should think about how can we organize these tasks that are sustaining our lives on a very daily basis. And I think that was a very interesting takeaway from the pandemics. But then also it was very visible in what hierarchical and unjust societies we are living, because I heard the saying, which I liked a lot. I don't remember who said it, but there was no such thing as a lockdown. There were just middle-class people hiding in their homes, and like other people going to work and delivering them food, which is totally true, because just for a certain class of the people, it was possible like to stay home, but for others it was not possible at all. And this showed in a very interesting way how the risks of that are created by a lot of environmental problems, and the pandemics is one of those risks. And other risks in this term are, of course, environmental pollution, which is a cause of a lot of death in a lot of countries worldwide, even now, and this will increase extremely. And this is very unjust. Like for some people, the risk is so much higher than for the middle classes and for the rich people. And I think that was very interesting in the pandemics, that it was so visible. And also maybe I think people became more aware of the existence of classes, and that they still do matter.
Yeah, I love that answer, and I will have more to say about it, because I love what you brought up, the class differences, the care work, because the next question I want to follow you is about the feminist critique of growth. But Aaron, why not you tell us your takeaway from the pandemic?
Yeah, I mean, one thing was interesting. I think we started working on the book together basically like when the pandemic started. And so we would have these meetings, and like the first big part of the meeting would just be like, what the hell is going on? What's going on in Germany? What's going on in Canada? And so if you read the book, like, you know, there's not a lot of personal things in the book, but we often started with, you know, the COVID-19 pandemic and as an example, and in different chapters we also finished with it as an example, just because it was just what was happening. And then also it was a very strange process to write a book, you know, over Zoom through these meetings. And then also, yeah, adding to what Andrea said is that I think, you know, when you look at the people, you know, there was always all this talk about people leaving the job market, and you know, the great, what was it being called? The great, yeah, well, anyway,
is it the great lying down or something like that?
Yeah, and I know in different, resignation, the great resignation, and then
right.
I think in different countries there was the lying down movement. Yep. And I think that was definitely part of it, but also you had, and so you had a lot of people realizing that, you know, this kind of treadmill of employment was just grinding them down. But then also, I think a huge part of it is like the majority of people who were quitting their jobs were women, and often it was because they were the ones who were having to do childcare or caring for elderly, and they just it was just hard to sustain. And with hospital systems collapsing, it was hard to sustain this kind of care while holding a job. And I think we have to really think of the COVID crisis as a care crisis, just underlying what Andrea said. At the same time, it was kind of an interesting moment in many ways, because all of a sudden you could see that, you know, after we've been told that, you know, this and this is impossible, no, you can't do that, all of a sudden things became very possible very fast. You know, countries switched whole industries to public production, you know, producing protective equipment, or you know, really making hospitals more, making the healthcare system like really
more
like
accessible.
More accessible, and guaranteeing things like vaccines, or guaranteeing tests. And then also in Canada, for example, and I benefited from this, there was basically a basic income measure that was put into place where everyone, as long as you could show that you weren't employed at that time, you were given a monthly payment. Yeah. So all of a sudden, like, all these things that seemed impossible became possible. And that's, I think, one thing that is maybe a hopeful thing, is that in times of crisis, you do start seeing a potential for a larger scale transformation.
Yeah, so I really appreciate you brought up those points, because that's obviously things that people should be able to observe, the vast social transformations and policies that you could just, you know, kind of like implement overnight because in recognition of a crisis. And we are in an ecological climate crisis, so why can't we do the same thing right now? So that's one thing. The other thing that I just want to say anecdotally is that, and you know, this is why I feel it relates to degrowth, is some people obviously experience a slowdown of the economy, slowdown in their life in terms of like the hustle and bustle culture. And some people do appreciate it. They kind of realize that, okay, I don't have to go to work every day, spend 9 hours a day at the office. I could work from home. I could spend more time looking after my family. You know, productivity is not necessarily that badly affected. The world still moves on. So I think people have found respite and they appreciated it. And the question is whether can we, of course, we don't want a pandemic to invoke this, but we want to be in a better state, you know, of well-being in the economy that still sustains and sustains us, but also not just us, but in the environment as well. Andrea, so I just said that, I love what you said just now about the care economy. And I want to get into the book now where, there are 7 forms of critiques of growth. So just down the list, you got ecological, socio-economical, cultural, capitalist exploitation, feminist industrialization, and North-South critique. So obviously can't go through all of it, and I'm keeping track of time. So I really want to get Andrea in right now because I want her to talk a bit more about the feminist critique. And I understand that even by the end of the book, you guys also talk about how that needs to be more richly expanded on and studied. So just to make it simple, maybe just tell us, why should feminists should be concerned or should like degrowth?
I mean, I often say that degrowth, it's just like feminist economics in a language that is gender neutral. So I think they are very much linked to each other, and also talking about feminist growth critique is very important because it was feminist theoreticians and economists who very much developed a lot of degrowth arguments in a time when the political left and the mainstream alike were turning away from growth critique in the 80s and 90s. And there was, on the one hand, developed this eco-modernism thought, and on the other hand, a big part of the political left still was very much caught in this progressive, productivist paradigm. And it was the feminist theoreticians, and they developed, for example, the subsistence perspective, which was an international perspective between different women from different parts of the world, developed this point of view that our economy, the capitalist economy, where it's about money, is very much based on a lot of economic activities that are not counted as economic activities, such as everything that's happening in the household, from childcare to elderly care to cooking and growing gardens, etc. And also the productivity of nature is not counted as productivity as such, but it's taken for granted, like an apple tree producing apples and the like. And this goes together because it's a kind of the same patriarchal trope, that it is white collar man, and it's also a racist, and not only sexist, also a racist trope, that it's white collar white men in offices who are running the world and who are deserving a lot of money for doing that. But in fact, they can just sit there all day on their desk because there's a lot of other people like doing the proper work. And so I think it's very much like you can't formulate a proper degrowth argument without considering feminist thoughts, at least I would say couldn't. And also it's providing us with the goal, as I said before, like what kind of economy we are aiming at with a degrowth perspective. We are aiming at an economy centered around care. And that is, of course, an argument that is developed in feminist discussions.
Thank you, Andrea. I know you have to go off. I just want to say thank you so much for being part of the conversation. And I really wanted that question in because I want you to answer it, because I think there needs to be a certain outreach to feminists when it comes to degrowth. And so I just wanted to make sure that we got that covered.
Yes, so thank you very much. It was very interesting to me. And I'm very interested also if there will be reactions, people, what they think about. And I wish you all the very best with developing some kind of degrowth chapter in Singapore. I would be, I would be very happy if you could keep in touch on that.
Yeah, I'll stay in touch. I actually had a lot of questions for you, Andrea, because I wanted to talk a bit about your interaction at the Berlin event where you were asked about your singling out of the rich and privileged class. But I'll leave that for Aaron to talk about.
Cool.
So thank you so much again,
Thanks
Andrea.
a lot.
Aaron, so maybe I just want to follow on from that and ask you on another form of critique, right, which is the industrialization critique. And in that critique, right, there is the idea that technology is not neutral. And I feel like that's very counterintuitive to most people, because they may say something like, oh, well, there's something political about, building a car or a phone, whether it's made under a capitalist or socialist system. So I just wanted you to kind of explain why that is not the case and why we need to look at, industrialization through a political lens. And, what would technological research, design, innovation look like under degrowth?
Yeah. So this phrase technology is not neutral, and also it's unfortunately also Andrea's specialty is technology studies and degrowth. So this phrase technology is not neutral is, you'll often also hear like, oh, it's not about the gun itself, it's about who holds the gun, or and so we have this idea that it's technology is just good in itself. What matters is what you do with it. But that's just not true if you look at maybe it's true on a very limited level, but if you actually scale up a technology, it has ramifications at what you could call artifacts, where they transform society and they have specific needs, infrastructural needs. So a car is a good example where if everyone has access to a car, that means we need to build highways and we need to build all the infrastructure for the highways. So we need a lot of cement. So we need to start, digging up more sand, and then we need more energy to create the cement. And then we also need fossil fuel infrastructure to power the cars. I heard recently that a massive amount of transport infrastructure is just for fossil fuels, so for oil essentially. So I think it's up to 40% or something like that. So just for everyone to have the car, it changes the whole thing. And then also another part of that is that once everyone starts having the car, then you don't actually have any choice but to get a car yourself. So you're kind of stuck in this what you could call a monopoly, a lifestyle monopoly, where you have to get a car if you want to get around, because everyone has a car. But then because everyone has a car, then also our cities are completely congested and full of traffic. So that's one example of a technology, and so I think degrowth, the critique of technology for degrowth is kind of starts okay, what is the impact if you scale this technology up, and is it a technology that actually contributes to people's life and well-being? And so we use the term convivial technology as a kind of counter to what you could call a authoritarian technology. An authoritarian technology is one that imposes a kind of life onto you, while a convivial one is that one that actually encourages relationships with people, better interaction with the environment. And Andrea has a journal article where she explains what the different aspects are of convivial technologies. And yeah, so I think that's a big part of the industrial critique in degrowth as well. And I think it's quite a bit different from a critique of capitalism, for example, because even if you were to have a socialist system, you might still have technologies that are developed that don't add to convivial experiences, and that depend on highly inefficient infrastructure to be maintained.
Yeah, actually, I do like that you use the car example, because definitely in countries like Singapore, Japan, Bangkok, high traffic, and there is definitely, politically speaking, one could make an argument to push for more public transport. But that also intersects with the capitalist lifestyle. People feel stressed that they need a car. They have to travel to pick up their kids. They have to travel to work. And if public transport isn't great, then they need to have a car. And a car becomes almost an essential item. Whereas if we had a different economy and one that obviously is less carbon intensive, maybe having a car wouldn't feel like a need and more like a luxury item. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So I also wanted to make sure that we covered the north-south critique, right? Because that's so essential to degrowth. And just to make it very simple for people to understand, basically the argument is that for people who live in the global north or populations of very rich countries, and the system is structured in such a way that we have to exploit the global south or poor nations for their resources. That's one good example is the iPhone. So the iPhone is said that, almost everything about it is produced and manufactured in the South, but the profits are booked as GDP in the USA. So just to frame this question, I noticed that there's been two recent developments. So one is Africa apparently is banning the export of raw lithium due to curb artisan mining, and Mexico nationalizing or creating some kind of state-run lithium company. So I do get it that from a degrowth perspective, this is probably a very favorable development, right? But there may be viewers who may feel like, this moves could either hurt the global economy or hurt the host country's economy. To some people that may feel that way, or consumers in the north will suffer the repercussions. So I was wondering if you can find a way to address their concerns, and more importantly, right, if we are truly sincere that you want to improve the economic and social well-being of the global south, what measures would facilitate that?
Yeah, I think the key question here is dependency, because let's say the global north degrows and then relies on way less material, way less mining and extraction, and way less consumer goods, and also then let's say a lot of these countries ban tourism to global south countries. That it's a fact that would decimate most countries in the world, and it would be a serious have a serious impact on social cohesion and on people's livelihoods. So that's a fact, but I think that that speaks to a kind of unequal dynamic between the global north and south of dependency, where the south depends on the north, but then also is kind of stuck in these in this kind of unequal type of development where they can't get out. So tourism is a good example of that, where you have let's say a beach town, or that's dependent on tourists to come, but people in that town are never able to develop. They depend on these waves of tourists, but they themselves can't necessarily develop infrastructure, schools, housing, hospitals for their own community, because the money comes in and then it also immediately leaves. So it's kind of like a why you see a lot of poverty in these kind of areas that depend on tourism. So there needs to be a different kind of development and a different kind of relationship. And the global north has an absolute responsibility to foster that, because of a historical responsibility. So it's nice to see now that people have been talking about, for example, climate reparations. And that's been really pushed by also a lot of African countries and Asian countries as well. And then, you could talk about developing different kinds of alliances between global south countries. And I think that kind of control over lithium, you could have what you could think of as like an OPEC for lithium, where they consolidate power because of this raw resource that the global north now needs for their green transition. So with I think with all that to say, there's I think the global south probably will be the leader in this kind of transition because of the immense power that they have, because they hold a lot of the resources that the global north seeks in right now. So yeah, there's a lot more to say, but I'll stop there.
Right. Are you able to go for maybe another 10, 15 more minutes just to check with you?
Sure. Yeah, that's great.
Okay, great. Yeah. So, because I'm kind of heading now to the last section of our conversation, which is now, to me, a bit more practical, a bit more about the way to actualize degrowth, right? So, first thing I want to ask you is actually a bit philosophical. It would have been interesting to hear Andrea's answer as well. But the idea is this: the question is this. When you talk about degrowth to people, right? Let's assume you meet someone and the person has no idea what degrowth is. What arguments or reasonings have you found to be very persuasive? And on a more philosophical note, right, do you find that people are more persuaded by, say, emotion narratives? So maybe if you describe the experiences of the global south, or do you find they're more persuaded by rational arguments? So if you say something about, say, the climate reparations, how it's very unjust, for the global south to suffer the consequences of climate change, vis-a-vis the global north. So yeah, do you find people are more persuaded by personal or societal level arguments?
Definitely personal, and I'll give a quick example. Is when I first started getting into degrowth, and I was talking to friends about it, and I would post about it on social media. A friend of mine contacted me and said, "Aaron, I want to talk about degrowth. Can we sit down to talk about degrowth?" And then we met, and she was like, "So tell me about degrowth." And I was like, well, so social metabolism, development and development alternatives. And she's like, no, I'm in a crisis in my life right now. I feel like I'm always on a treadmill. Like I can't keep going like this, and I have too much work, and I'm not getting paid enough, and meanwhile, like I can't care for myself and people I love. And that's what degrowth brought to mind. And I realized that I was like completely talking past her, and not that those other things didn't interest her, but when the term degrowth, when she saw it, it really felt quite visceral to her in the way that it affected her personal life, that she felt like she was living this life of acceleration and not being able to slow down. And I've noticed that, like, in the conversations following when this book came out, we did reading groups, and we did I've done like smaller conversations with groups of friends, but also like larger in lecture halls with students, and then also in like activist centers. So I noticed that the personal really is a really important way that people engage with degrowth, and often it is that kind of like sense of alienation from their work or from the environment that people feel, and that I think animates their interest in degrowth. And for me, that makes a lot of sense because we primarily feel capitalism as an alienating experience. It's not that we're not getting all the things that we need, which we're not, but so much of what and we talk about in the book, that Marx talked about this a lot, where he saw how capitalism, it's what's so harmful about it is that you're so removed from the thing that you're doing 8 hours a day. You're not getting access to the the fruit of your labor. And you know, we also feel that in terms of in where we live, like in the neighborhoods we live, we live so distantly from people, and we want that kind of sense of community and feeling like you're a part of something. And I think that's how a lot of people come to degrowth and why it makes sense to them intuitively.
Yeah, and so on that note as well, I also want to ask you, what other ways of communicating degrowth to the mass audience do you think is needed? So I mentioned in your introduction, you're interested in science fiction, and so there've been some examples of that, right? Novels from, say, Ursula Le Guin, something more recent like Kim Stanley Robinson's Ministry for the Future. It's not a degrowth book, but it's a science fiction book. And I also want to ask you, what's your reaction to, say, movies like Don't Look Up, which I noticed that, it doesn't have a positive, bright future. The movie ended on a very pessimistic note, but then again, it really galvanized, made people really emotionally compelled to want to do something about climate change. And so, what's your take? Like, do you think, or do we need a movie like Avatar? Some people are saying that Avatar is a great movie, talking and extolling people to care more about the environment.
Yeah, I think ultimately, like, a lot of political messaging is about storytelling, and it's about kind of spurring the imagination, because that's what politics requires, is the imagination to be able to think things differently, to be able to change the world together. So it makes a lot of sense that the science fiction really encourages that. And like, personally, that's part of my interest in science fiction. Although I was interested in science fiction before I was interested in degrowth. Like, I've always been. Yeah, I think it's partly, at the same time, I think we need more imaginative stories, because the ones that we have, science fiction itself is often very, like, high tech and, like, productivist oriented. When you could think of permaculture or healthcare as high tech as well. So yeah, I think there's room for more science fiction, and it was interesting that Don't Look Up was so well received. But still, I think there's not a lot of climate change mass media, like popular media stories out there. Even Don't Look Up wasn't a climate change story. Like, it was a metaphor for climate change, but the problem with it was it's a comet that's going to hit the Earth, but that's the inevitable part. Well, climate change is not inevitable. It's something that we can actually change to address. So yeah, I think there's still, like, more need for those kinds of stories. Dune is a ecological science fiction, and I think that's something very interesting about it. So yeah, I think science fiction has a huge role to play today in shaping the imagination.
Right. So not exactly related to science fiction, but something to do with actually the finance economy. And the reason why I ask this is because I've actually seen people within the cryptocurrency sphere and spaces tackle the question of degrowth. Specifically, there was one author called Noah Smith who tried to suggest that the way to address degrowth is that he recognized that the planet has finite resources. So he suggested that we move over to the metaverse to generate more economic growth there, because it's potentially infinite. And to him, he I'm quoting here from his article, it's possible to imagine a virtual environment with no increase in real resource use. And imagine sometime in the future with highly advanced technology, we create a complete physical exact simulation of the Earth, and complete with 554 million digitized human beings. And so he says it's a very real increase in GDP, but here's the part which I find pretty absurd, which is he thinks that digital people will see their lives improve, they'll pay for the improvement in digital marketplaces, there'll be nothing fake about that GDP. A digital car that a digital person pays for in a digital marketplace represents every bit as much as the economic value has the real world equivalent. So that's the part I find pretty absurd. But yeah, I want you to tackle this question about the finance economy, because obviously there's a certain element, a certain segment of the population we have to address, which is the wealthy classes, right? They profit a lot from obviously the speculative finance economy. They would be the ones most resistant to degrowth because they're already resistant to market regulation, environmental labor protections. They're very addicted to growth as well. So it's a gigantic problem, and I'm wondering if you can share your thoughts about what a reform finance system would look like. One that is stripped of being addicted to growth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's. I remember coming across that article as well, and it was more funny than anything else, because of how serious the author thought of his idea was. But I think it represents a really interesting question because, first of all, we can easily say that economic growth, GDP, is very highly coupled to environmental impacts. That's quite obvious. And that's in this economy, in this world that we're talking about. And the evidence that we have for those being decoupled is very slim, and it's very very small time scales and very localized, and not at the scale that which is the global scale, because climate change is a global issue. That's not happening, so we don't have evidence that that's happening. But beyond that, it's like we don't even have to. It's like, why do we need to have to imagine this digital world that could increase wealth exponentially when we have this world where we could also just what we argue is that we could decouple well-being from economic growth. Like, we don't need the economic growth part. We can just create a world here of leisure, of convivial lifestyles, of lifestyles that aren't extractive of other people elsewhere. And we could do that here, and we could meet people's basic needs and their leisure and desires and other things in this world. And so if you think about like a financial system that would be set up for that, right now the financial system is essentially if you kind of strip it down to its basic, how it works is, if you have money, if you have lots of money, you can invest it somewhere and then you make more money. But usually people who have lots of money, they don't invest it. They actually take out loans and use that loan to then create more money because of the future value. So they take out loans from the banks or from other investors. And if you think of a degrowth economy, well, the problem with that is that it privatizes wealth, right? So it's like, what that's saying is that individual owners, they are able to take to get money from the bank, and they can make more money with that. But like in a degrowth economy, you could actually change that so that society is able to create loans and invest it in things that they want. And it would be a very different system, but it would be a financial system that's basically that's based on public wealth rather than privatized wealth. And it would also be a system that favors public abundance, which is a term we use in the book, instead of private abundance, which is, the imperial mode of living that we've talked about.
Yeah, I think that's good. I think that's kind of a good way of framing it. Obviously, it's too general topic for us to get deep into, but I get the idea. I think people should get the idea that they should really examine the finance system and see what kind of wealth it generates and who are the beneficiaries, right? Not exactly the public, but the private sector. So I think let's try and end it with two questions. So I wanted to, there's so many good questions I want to ask. Maybe let me try this one. So if I'm not mistaken, I understand that you have colleagues or fellow scientists who have participated in protests. I think this is in Germany, but it's also in other places as well. And this is sometimes come at great cost, right? Just recently, more than 100 riders signed a letter in solidarity with the UK climate protest prisoners, because in the UK, some of these climate activists are being potentially, I think, sentenced to jail time. So I find that there may be sometimes viewers who just don't understand. They don't understand why university professors, climate scientists, young activists are undertaking such drastic actions. And they, of course, think of it as a great inconvenience. They are very disruptive. But I really want you to be that voice and explain what goes through their mind when they decide to protest.
Yeah, so unfortunately, Matthias can't be the voice here, but he's right now involved with actions against expansion of a coal mine in Germany, and he's and Andrea as well have both been involved with these kinds of very direct actions, blocking police and stopping the production of a coal mine for certain times in Germany. Personally, I've also been part of actions like that when I was doing my PhD in London. I was involved with some direct actions from the climate justice movement there, and I think there's many ways to explain it, but for me, a really important way to think about it is that that all of us kind of engage with the media as this kind of spectacle that we're always just kind of getting the new topics and the new spectacles, and the only way that you can actually kind of break through the discourse is to create a spectacle in today's media environment. And I think that's a lot of what these climate justice activists are doing is they're forced because nothing is happening. Every single conference of the parties around climate change that has happened, there actually hasn't led to any significant changes in what needs to happen, and they've been going on for decades. So there needs to be a social recognition, but for that there needs to be people need to be heard, and the best way to do that is to do these kind of spectacular actions that break through the media bubble. And so I think that's one of the arguments. And none of these actions actually, except for the protesters themselves being assaulted by police, they're not violent against anyone. They're nonviolent actions, and perhaps yes, they affect private property. And the police are attacking them for that reason. But I think that itself should cause us to think about, why do we consider, defacing private property as a more violent thing than, for example, the international corporations that are raising rainforests for palm plantations, or that are profiting spectacularly from fossil fuels that are killing future generations. Why is that not violent, and why is just this very small action considered a violent action. Yeah, I'm not the best advocate or spokesperson, but those are some of my thoughts around it.
No, I think that's good. I think that's a good way of kind of framing it, a way to make us question our priorities, what we value in life, private property, or our lives, or lives of people who are marginalized and vulnerable. And I think it's really a spectacular failure of the media system that doesn't try to posit such questions to make us question better, to really examine our lives and with better clarity, moral clarity. And so, yeah, I kind of put the fault on them. I want to synthesize two questions into one. So this is what I'm going to do. So, what you said just now, everything you said is so factually true, right? We just are not seeing great political maneuvers from our leaders, from countries to just, deal with the climate crisis and ecological crisis seriously. Nevertheless, I have been seeing, for example, on Al Jazeera, it goes back to the media actually, Al Jazeera English produced a series called All Hail the Planet, and one video is actually titled Our Obsession with Economic Growth is Deadly. It actually features, Jason Hickel, Juliet Skoll, and degrowth was actually talked about in the documentary, so that's great. I understand that in Japan, there's going to be a degrowth book called Marx in the Anthropocene, and that's by scholar Kohei Saito, and it's apparently a bestseller. And the subtitle is actually called Towards the Idea of Degrowth Communism. So that's exciting. That's interesting to see. So juxtaposing that, right, in your book, now I want to get back into what you did say in the book, what you laid out, this framework of different types of strategies, non-reformist reforms, ruptural strategies, and nowtopias. So obviously the non-reformist reforms and the ruptural strategies are very fundamental, very significant. As you just described with your protests, they disrupt the flow of power, change the order of society if possible. So why don't we try to think of nowtopias, and as you explained it, they're just collective spaces that they can exist in the here and now. One example I can think of is that at least locally, we have some people who try to develop their own library, public libraries. There's some small mutual aid organizations. People try to organize and create their own commons. So maybe sharing household equipment, instead of buying new ones. But I'd like you to, just kind of give us a conclusion. What is your, aspirations, ideas about how people can enact degrowth or apply the principles of degrowth the way they can right now? You can use examples, obviously, from other countries. With everything I just described about the media, that small stream of pro degrowth literature out there, are you optimistic?
Yeah, I'll start with the media question first, because I have seen a huge change in profiles about degrowth, and also just engagement with these ideas, even when it's not called degrowth. But yeah, Kohei Saito's popularity in Japan. Our book is being translated into Korean right now, which is also really exciting. Just the amount of profiles about degrowth that have been appearing in places like CNBC, CNN, The Guardian, and really BBC, very big news, and Al Jazeera as well has been engaging with it for quite a while, and they also publish a lot of Jason Hickel's column pieces. So I do think it is promising, and I have felt a huge change in the last 2 years especially in the United States, where people are suddenly become really interested in degrowth. So in terms of how how people can engage with degrowth in where they are and in their own lives, it's interesting. I did a exercise with a class recently where I put the nowtopias, the non-reformist reforms, which are these policies that might seem like they're just small reforms, but actually open the door to much bigger changes. And the ruptural strategies, I put them on a triangle and asked students to place what they're involved in or where they'd like to be involved in. And people place themselves a lot on the nowtopias. So a lot of people are engaged with like local neighborhood initiatives. They're engaged with these kinds of small initiatives that might seem very small and just like, you know, maybe you wouldn't even be able to scale them up so easily. But what's really special about them is that it's almost like the way science fiction work, what we were talking about. It's a small example of how to do things differently that allows you to see that things can be different, that an economic system can work differently, that it can be based on sharing, on the commons, and on mutual aid. And I think, you know, we do, like, I think it's really important to do that, but we do have to think carefully about, like, I think it's important not to imagine saying, okay, these nowtopias will just multiply and multiply and multiply and then replace the existing world, because you know, there's no evidence that itself is going to happen. And that's why these other strategies are also important, is that, you know, you need policy changes that strengthen these nowtopias. And then you also need direct ruptural strategies, direct actions that push politicians to make those changes. And also a lot of these small initiatives, you know, it might be, it's often certain kinds of people who have time and who have the resources to join them. So like, there's a lot of questions there. But what we do say in the book is we say that nowtopias are the education of desire. Like they teach us how to want a different world. And then, for example, in a moment of crisis, it's these nowtopias that actually become a model for what a different world could look like. And we use them as models. So I think they're really important because they kind of like keep our hopes up in dark times as well. But in terms of like how people can engage in their personal lives, you know, there isn't one strategy, and we're all very different people. Like, so for some people, they might be very extroverted and they would love, you know, spending time with people all the time. But for other people, it's like about doing research and maybe writing policy suggestions for politicians. So I think it's really about like, I think the important thing is like working together, working collectively, finding people that are like-minded and beginning from there. And also something we say is like, you don't have to call it degrowth. Like, actually, we don't care what you call it. It's just as long as we're working towards the same goal and we have that same kind of vision of what it will be, I think that's the important part.
Yeah, there was actually a question I wanted to ask regarding whether it's useful to use the word degrowth. And I understand there's a bit of tension. Academically, some scholars prefer to keep it, to retain it because of its richness, and to, you know, I can see in the academic context why this is very important. It definitely demarcates and puts a very precise definition of what degrowth is about. But maybe, yes, in the political world, you know, we need to lose that label because we just want something that has a bit less baggage, easier to resonate with people, something perhaps a bit more positive and uplifting. So yeah, Aaron, thanks so much for staying all the way through. I really appreciate it. And I really hope that, you know, with our conversation, people will have a very personal motivation to get the book itself, right? So here it is, once again, folks, The Future is Degrowth, a guide to a world beyond capitalism. Thanks so much, Aaron, and all the best for you and the book as well.
Thank you so much, Douglas. I'm really excited to hear how more about how people receive degrowth in Singapore, and yeah, all the best with your channel.